Elections in Belarus have been a sham for years. Brazen fraud, brutal repression, and a population yearning for change characterize Alexander Lukashenko's regime. Let's explore the dark history of elections in Belarus and examine the scathing criticisms of Lukashenko's government since he came to power in 1994. Prepare to understand the revealing truth about what is known as Europe's last dictatorship. Located in Eastern Europe, Belarus borders Russia to the east, Ukraine to the south, Poland to the west, and Lithuania and Latvia to the north. With a population of approximately 9.4 million people, its capital is Minsk. Geopolitically, Belarus is a close ally of Russia with strong economic and military ties, especially after the Ukraine crisis in 2014. The Belarusian economy is highly dependent on Russia, both for energy and trade. Now that you have a basic understanding of Belarus, let's dive into the history of fraudulent elections and the era of Alexander Lukashenko, a leader whose tenure has been marked by authoritarianism and repression. Alexander Lukashenko was first elected in 1994, promising to end corruption and improve the economy. However, he quickly began to show authoritarian tendencies. In 1996, a controversial referendum expanded his powers, allowing him to dissolve parliament and extend his mandate. With these new powers, he silenced independent media and suppressed political opposition, laying the foundation for an authoritarian regime. These early years were critical in consolidating his power, and any form of dissent was swiftly crushed. As Lukashenko consolidated his power, subsequent elections revealed an increasingly evident pattern of fraud and repression. The presidential elections of 2006, 2010, 2015 and 2020 followed a pattern of fraud and repression. The elections of 2006 and 2010 were marked by widespread allegations of fraud and violent suppression of protests. International observers, such as the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, condemned the electoral irregularities. Any attempt at protest during these elections was brutally crushed by police force. In the 2015 elections, Lukashenko secured another term in an electoral process widely regarded as neither free nor fair. The opposition was heavily monitored, with many candidates arrested or barred from participating. The 2020 elections were a turning point. With massive vote-rigging allegations, the opposition, led by Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya, claimed victory. Massive protests followed, with hundreds of thousands of people taking to the streets of Minsk and other cities. The government's response was brutal, with mass arrests and excessive force used against peaceful protesters. The images of violence and the courage of the demonstrators resonated internationally, but the repression was relentless. Have you heard about the situation in Belarus? What do you think about it? Leave a comment below and join the discussion. The political repression following the 2020 elections was not an isolated event, but part of a continuous pattern of human rights violations and repression. After the 2020 elections, political repression in Belarus intensified. Thousands of people were arrested for political reasons, facing incommunicado detention, torture, and ill treatment. Human rights organizations reported extreme abuses in prisons. Belarus also allowed Russia to use its territory to launch attacks against Ukraine, increasing international pressure on Lukashenko's regime. In response, the EU and the US imposed severe sanctions affecting the country's economy. These sanctions aimed to pressure the government to respect human rights and undertake democratic reforms, but also severely impacted the Belarusian economy, which was already heavily reliant on Russian support. To better understand the depth of the criticisms against Lukashenko's government, it is essential to examine the various areas in which his regime has been condemned. Since the beginning of his rule, Lukashenko has maintained strict control over the media. Journalists are frequently harassed, imprisoned, and even disappeared. Freedom of expression in Belarus is severely limited, with many independent media outlets being shut down or operating in exile. State media is used as a propaganda tool to maintain control over the political narrative. Belarus has one of the lowest rankings in the Press Freedom Index, published by Reporters Without Borders. In 2023, Belarus was among the worst countries in the world in terms of press freedom, reflecting the repressive and dangerous environment for journalists. Media repression is just one piece of the puzzle. Human rights violations are equally alarming and are a constant under Lukashenko's regime. Reports of torture, arbitrary detentions and persecution of political opponents are common. Vyasna, one of the main human rights organizations in Belarus, has documented these abuses for years, despite facing constant repression. The situation worsened after the 2020 protests, when thousands of demonstrators were detained and many reported torture and ill treatment in prisons. International organizations, including Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, have repeatedly condemned the Belarusian government for its abusive practices. Election manipulation is another severe criticism of Lukashenko's government. Elections in Belarus under Lukashenko have never been considered free and fair by international observers. Electoral fraud is a common practice to ensure his continued power. Each electoral cycle is marked by irregularities, with international observers often being barred from conducting thorough oversight. The 1996 referendum was the first clear sign that Lukashenko had no intention of relinquishing power. Since then, each subsequent election has been marred by allegations of fraud and violent repression against protesters and political opponents. Beyond electoral manipulation, economic dependence on Russia also raises serious concerns. The Belarusian economy is heavily dependent on Russia, which has significant implications for the country's sovereignty and foreign policy. Lukashenko has maintained a close relationship with Moscow to secure economic and political support. This dependence limits Belarus's ability to adopt independent policies and reinforces Lukashenko's position as a strategic ally of Putin. This dependence is particularly evident in the energy sector, where Belarus relies heavily on Russian natural gas and oil. Russia has used this dependence as a political tool, demanding loyalty in exchange for lower prices and economic subsidies. Finally, corruption is a persistent stain on Lukashenko's government. Lukashenko's government is widely seen as corrupt, with nepotism and favoritism being common practices. Endemic corruption has hindered the country's economic and social development. Public resources are often diverted into the pockets of a ruling elite, while the general population faces economic hardships. Transparency and anti-corruption organizations rank Belarus as one of the most corrupt countries in Europe. The lack of transparency and the absence of effective control mechanisms allow corruption to flourish, negatively impacting all aspects of public and economic life. Belarus's recent history under Alexander Lukashenko is marked by repression, electoral fraud, and severe human rights violations. Since coming to power in 1994, Lukashenko has maintained his control through systematic election manipulation, silencing of independent media, and brutal repression of any form of dissent. Economic dependence on Russia and endemic corruption have further aggravated the situation, limiting the country's economic and social development. Despite these adversities, the Belarusian population continues to show remarkable courage in their fight for freedom and justice. The 2020 protests highlighted a deep desire for change, which was brutally repressed but made clear that the demand for democracy and human rights persists. The situation in Belarus serves as a warning about the dangers of authoritarianism and the importance of protecting democratic freedoms. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Your support is crucial for us to continue bringing content like this. Leave your comment below with your opinion on the situation in Belarus, and let us know what other topics you would like to see on the channel. Thank you very much for watching today's video, and see you next time.